A wild bear knocked on the door for hours. The family was stunned by what happened next. It was a crisp autumn evening when the Johnson family settled down for dinner. The last light of the day faded behind the trees, casting long shadows over their quiet farmhouse. Inside, the warm glow of the kitchen lights filled the room as the smell of Mary's homemade stew lingered in the air. Laughter bubbled up from their two young children, Emma and Ben, as they bickered playfully about who got the last piece of bread. John, the father, sat back in his chair, his thoughts wandering to the list of chores that still needed doing. The peaceful calm of the evening was suddenly interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Knock, 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 knock. At first, they all froze, unsure of what they had heard. It wasn't the usual knock. No one ever came by this time of night. John glanced at Mary, raising an eyebrow. Mary's face was just as puzzled. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood up. Knock, 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 knock. The knocking came again, this time louder, more urgent. A chill ran down John's spine. No one came this late, especially not out here. He stood up slowly, his eyes meeting his wife's. Who could that be? Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. John shook his head, walking toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he hesitated. The sound outside had been strange, too heavy, too persistent. Maybe it was a neighbor needing something. But then again, why wouldn't they call first? Another knock. The sound was louder than before, almost demanding. He took a deep breath, hand on the door. What was waiting for them outside? The Johnson family's home sat at the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by acres of forest and wide-open fields. It was a place that felt distant from the noise and rush of modern life. A farmhouse that had seen better days, but still held a charm that made it the perfect place to raise a family. The worn wooden porch creaked underfoot as the family spent their evenings sitting out on the swing, watching the sunset over the trees. Inside, the house was cozy, filled with the warmth of a life built around simple joys. The kitchen was always the heart of the home. Mary, the mother, had a natural grace about her. She was the calm in the storm of daily life, always on top of things, always knowing where everything was. Tonight, she was preparing dinner as the soft sounds of a slow jazz station played in the background. The smells of hearty stew and freshly baked bread filled the air, drawing the kids into the kitchen. John, the father, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a rugged look that came from years of working hard with his hands. He was a man of few words, but his love for his family showed in the little things. The way he'd come in from the fields to help with dinner, or how he'd spend hours in the garden, making sure the crops were well tended. He had a certain peace about him, a calm confidence that made him the steady anchor of the family. Their children, Emma and Ben, filled the house with laughter and energy. Emma, at 12, was already becoming quite the young lady, smart, perceptive, with a touch of stubbornness. Ben, at 8, had more energy than anyone could handle. He was always outside, running around, exploring the woods, and looking for adventure. The two of them fought like typical siblings, but their bond was undeniable. They were a close-knit family, content with their lives and the quiet beauty of the world around them. Tonight, like many others, they gathered together in the kitchen, chatting about their day. The table was set, and John was about to dish out the stew when the first knock came at the door. It wasn't the sound of a typical visitor, a friendly knock or a polite tap. It was louder, more insistent, the kind of knock that sent an odd chill through the air. John stood up, his brow furrowed. "I'll check it out," he said, reaching for the door. As he walked toward the entrance, the family fell into an uneasy silence. Something about this night felt off. The peace they had known for years, tucked away in their little corner of the world, was about to be shaken. John reached for the door handle, his mind racing with questions. Who could possibly be at the door at this time of night? He hesitated for a moment, peering through the small crack in the curtains. The porch light flickered on, casting a dim glow over the yard, but there was no one in sight. Just as he was about to pull the door open, the sound of another knock echoed through the house. This time louder, almost frantic. Knock, knock. John's heart skipped a beat. He opened the door cautiously, expecting to find a neighbor, a late-night visitor, or maybe someone asking for directions. Instead, standing just beyond the threshold was a large figure, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was too big, too broad to be human. The moment John saw it, his breath caught in his chest. A bear, a massive black bear, its fur gleaming in the pale light, stood on its hind legs. Its large paws rested against the door frame, as though it was trying to push its way in. The bear's eyes were wide and unblinking, and its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, sensing something. John could hear the bear's heavy breathing, the rustling of its fur in the breeze. The family dog, Max, barked wildly from the kitchen, but John barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the animal in front of him. For a moment, there was complete silence. Time seemed to freeze. John was frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this a wild bear just passing through? Or had it wandered in from the nearby forest, lost or looking for food? Bears weren't uncommon in this part of the country, but they usually stayed far away from people. And they certainly didn't knock on doors. As John stood there, trying to process what he was seeing, the bear let out a soft grunt. It leaned forward, placing its front paws gently on the porch, as if testing the ground. The massive creature looked almost confused. It wasn't aggressive, but its size and presence alone were enough to send a shiver down John's spine. He didn't dare move. He didn't want to provoke it. The last thing he needed was a bear breaking into the house. John glanced back into the house. His family was just as stunned as he was. Mary stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, her hand over her mouth in disbelief. Ben had stepped behind his father, peering around him, wide-eyed. Emma, usually the brave one, was staring from the safety of the hallway, clutching the back of the couch. The bear seemed to sense their fear, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air again. Slowly, almost hesitantly, it lowered itself back down onto all fours, its massive head still turned toward the door. John's mind raced. Should he call animal control? Should he try to scare it off? The bear didn't look like it wanted to fight. It just looked confused, maybe even desperate. Suddenly, the bear let out another low grunt and took a small step closer, its nose now just inches from John's hand, which still rested on the door handle. John didn't know what to do. His thoughts were all jumbled, but one thing was clear. This bear wasn't behaving like any wild animal he'd encountered. There was something different about it. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't aggressive. It was as if the bear was trying to communicate, to ask for something. John took a tentative step back, his hand still on the door. "Mary, call animal control," he whispered, but his voice trembled as he said it. There was something about the bear's calm demeanor that made him hesitate. Was this just a hungry bear? Or was there something more to this strange visit? The knock was still echoing in the stillness of the night when John slowly opened the door. His pulse quickened. A neighbor? A late visitor? The possibilities swirled in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. A massive black bear stood at the doorstep, its glossy fur shimmering under the dim light of the porch. It wasn't standing up like he'd expected, but hunched slightly, its heavy front paws resting on the top of the porch railing as it peered curiously at him. Its dark eyes glistened in the light, focused and alert. The animal's head was tilted slightly, as if trying to understand something, its huge nostrils flaring and exhaling with deep, rhythmic breaths. John froze. The bear was close enough that he could almost feel its breath on his face, the wild scent of the forest in the air around it. It seemed like a surreal moment, a wild animal in the middle of their yard at 9 p.m., knocking on their door. The animal's presence was imposing, yet there was no immediate sign of aggression. It didn't growl or show its teeth, but simply stood there, its gaze steady, as if waiting for something, maybe for a response. Knock, knock. The bear tapped its paw again, the sound a heavy thud against the wooden door frame. John's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to slam the door shut and retreat to safety, but his feet felt frozen to the ground. What was happening? Was this even real? Inside, Mary had heard the sound too. She peeked from the kitchen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Emma and Ben stood behind her, whispering and leaning forward, trying to get a glimpse of the enormous creature at the door. John barely moved, his hand still gripping the door. There was no obvious threat, but that didn't mean it was safe. The last thing he needed was for the bear to feel threatened or confused. "John, what is that?" Mary whispered from behind him, her voice quivering with uncertainty. John couldn't take his eyes off the bear. "It's a bear," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "It's knocking on our door." The bear's attention never left John. It tilted its head slightly, as if trying to process the strange interaction. The bear's eyes were full of something. Curiosity? Confusion? Or perhaps even desperation? John couldn't tell. It didn't seem like an ordinary encounter with wildlife, and it certainly wasn't acting the way he expected. Normally, bears avoided human homes. They steered clear of human interaction, especially at night. But here, this bear was standing on their doorstep, its behavior far from what they'd seen in the forest. It wasn't trying to attack or run away. It was waiting. The silence between the bear and the family was almost unbearable. It felt like time had frozen. Then, as if to break the tension, the bear leaned forward slightly, placing a large paw on the porch railing. It made no sound, but the sheer size and weight of the creature seemed to make the house tremble. John took a half step back, but the bear didn't move forward. It simply remained there, motionless. Suddenly, the family dog, Max, barked from inside the house. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but it didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, almost as if it was listening intently. "Mary," John said softly, "call animal control, but be careful. I'm not sure what this bear wants." There was no obvious aggression from the bear, just a strange persistence, the odd behavior that was too human-like to ignore. It seemed as if the animal was communicating something beyond hunger or fear. What was it trying to tell them? John remained still, the door half open, and the bear's gaze locked on his every move. Neither side seemed sure of what to do next. The moments after the bear's initial encounter were filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind and the distant barking of Max inside. The Johnson family stood frozen in place, staring at the creature on the porch. Mary clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white, while Emma and Ben huddled behind her, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. John was still holding the door, unsure what to do next. The bear stood in front of him, its massive frame blocking most of the light from the porch. It wasn't acting like any wild animal he had encountered. It wasn't charging. It wasn't growling or showing any signs of aggression. But there was something about its stillness, the way it remained so calm, that sent a shiver down his spine. "John, what is it doing?" Mary asked, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief. John swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't know, but I don't like this. We need to figure out how to handle this before it gets worse." The bear continued to stand motionless on the porch, its eyes locked on John, never breaking the stare. It was almost as if the animal was studying them, waiting for a response. John glanced at Mary, his mind racing with possibilities. Should he retreat into the house and call animal control? Should he try to scare the bear off? His instincts told him to protect his family, but there was something unnerving about the bear's quiet demeanor. Should we call someone?" Mary whispered, her gaze darting between John and the bear. John didn't answer immediately. His mind was a whirlwind. The last thing he wanted was to make any sudden moves. Bears were unpredictable, especially when they felt cornered. And this bear, this wasn't just any wild animal. Its calmness was unsettling. He was used to dealing with wild animals in the area, but this felt different. It didn't belong here, and it wasn't leaving. "I'll call animal control," Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She took a cautious step back into the kitchen, her phone already in hand, dialing the emergency line. The bear remained in place, watching them, as though it understood that the family was discussing it. John felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. He couldn't shake the feeling that this bear was no ordinary animal. It wasn't acting out of hunger or territoriality. It was as if it was searching for something. Ben, who had been peeking around his mother's legs, finally spoke up. "Dad, why is it just standing there? It's not moving. It's not trying to hurt us." John glanced down at his son, a hint of surprise in his eyes. Ben was usually the first to panic, but now he seemed oddly calm. His gaze was fixed on the bear, as if he was trying to understand what was happening. John wasn't sure how to explain it to him. There was no easy way to make sense of this situation. "I don't know, Ben," John replied, his voice low, "but we need to stay calm. We don't want to provoke it." As Mary spoke to animal control, John slowly stepped back from the door, his eyes never leaving the bear. The family was tense, the air thick with uncertainty. Emma was whispering something to Ben, trying to keep him calm, but her voice was barely audible. Even the dog, Max, had gone quiet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. John's mind raced. What if the bear wasn't leaving? What if it didn't understand what a door meant? What if this wasn't just about food, but something else entirely? The tension in the room was unbearable. The family had no way of knowing what the bear wanted or why it had come here. All they knew was that it had been knocking on their door, seemingly asking for something. And as the minutes ticked by, the question loomed larger in John's mind. What was the bear really after? As the minutes dragged on, the air in the house grew thick with uncertainty. John could hear Mary on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones to animal control, but his attention was still focused on the bear. The creature hadn't moved an inch, its gaze unwavering. Its massive form stood in stark contrast to the small, warm house, but its stillness now felt almost surreal, as if it didn't belong in this world at all. Suddenly, without warning, the bear lowered its head, its ears twitching as if it had heard something. John froze, his heart pounding. What was it doing now? Was it about to charge? His muscles tensed, ready to slam the door shut if needed. But the bear didn't charge. Instead, it let out a low, rumbling growl, soft, almost apologetic, like a creature unsure of what it was supposed to do next. For the briefest of moments, John thought he saw something in the bear's eyes. There was fear, and then, in a blink, the bear took a step back, away from the door. Before John could react, the bear did something completely unexpected. It turned its back on the house and walked a few steps toward the side of the porch. The tension in the room seemed to snap, replaced by confusion. Was it leaving? The family watched in stunned silence as the bear slowly lowered its head again, this time to the ground, sniffing at something just off the porch. It pawed at the earth beneath it, moving with deliberation. The knock on the door, the strange behavior, it all seemed to make sense now. John's eyes widened in disbelief. The bear wasn't just acting strangely out of hunger or curiosity. It had been looking for something. And now, with gentle movements, it had uncovered what it had been searching for. A small, hidden nest of baby rabbits. John felt a wave of realization wash over him. The bear hadn't been interested in food for itself. It was after its young, or at least, it had sensed their presence near the house. The family had always known there were animals living around their property, foxes, deer, and even rabbits. But the idea that a bear would be concerned for a nest of rabbits in their yard was something John hadn't expected. As the bear continued to paw gently at the earth, the family stood quietly, processing what was unfolding before them. The creature's behavior shifted again, becoming more protective. It wasn't just the fear of hunger that had driven the bear here. It was something deeper. The bear was likely trying to find a safe place for its young, or maybe even searching for them after they had wandered off. Mary, who had been watching from the kitchen, came over to stand beside John, her expression still tense but softening. "It's not here to hurt us," she whispered, as if she were speaking to herself more than to him. For the first time since the bear's arrival, John could see the situation in a new light. It wasn't about survival for the bear alone, it was about protection. The bear wasn't invading their home. It was trying to protect its family, just as they were trying to protect theirs. With one last glance at the nest, the bear gave a low grunt, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned away from the house, retreating back into the forest. John stood there for a moment longer, staring at the empty porch, his heart still racing, but now filled with a strange sense of understanding. John stood frozen, staring at the small nest of baby rabbits the bear had uncovered. The realization settled over him like a weight. This whole time, the bear hadn't been a threat. It had been searching, knocking on their door not for food, but for help. Mary stepped forward cautiously, her eyes flickering between the rabbits and the retreating figure of the bear. The massive creature had stopped a few feet away, turning its head slightly, as if waiting, watching. It didn't growl, didn't move aggressively. It simply stood, its deep brown eyes locked onto them with something John could only describe as patience. "John," Mary whispered, "it wasn't here to hurt us, was it?" John exhaled slowly. "No," he admitted. I think it was trying to get us to notice them." He nodded toward the tiny, trembling forms of the rabbits. Emma and Ben, still clinging to their mother's side, stepped forward carefully. Ben's eyes were wide with wonder. "The bear, it knew they were here?" he asked in a hushed voice. "It sure seems that way." John replied, kneeling next to the small creatures. The nest had been disturbed, possibly by wind or another animal, and the babies were exposed, barely moving. They were vulnerable, and in the cold autumn air, they wouldn't survive long without protection. Mary knelt beside him. We have to do something. We can't just leave them like this. John hesitated. He wasn't an expert on wildlife, but he knew interfering too much could be dangerous. The mother rabbit was nowhere in sight, maybe scared off by the bear or simply out looking for food. If they left the babies alone, they might not make it through the night. Meanwhile, the bear gave a soft grunt, shifting its weight from one paw to another. It wasn't leaving, but it wasn't coming closer either. It was almost as if it was waiting for them to act. Mary's voice broke his thoughts. We need to at least cover them back up, keep them warm. John nodded. Let's do it quickly. He carefully gathered bits of dried grass and soft leaves, using them to gently cover the baby rabbits again. The tiny creatures twitched, but they remained still, as if sensing the warmth returning around them. Will the mother come back? Emma asked. John glanced at her. Hopefully. If we don't disturb them too much, she might return soon. They worked quickly, mindful of the bear's presence just a few yards away. It didn't move, didn't interfere. It just waited. Once the nest was secure, John finally stood up, brushing off his hands. He turned to face the bear fully. It's done, he murmured, not expecting a response, but something in him felt the need to say it. The bear let out a slow exhale, its large chest rising and falling as if it understood. Then, without another sound, it turned away, its massive body retreating into the woods. Within seconds, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving the family standing in stunned silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the cool evening air. Then, Ben broke the silence. That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. John let out a shaky laugh, tension finally easing from his shoulders. He ruffled Ben's hair. Yeah, kid, it really was. Mary wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes still locked on the place where the bear had vanished. I don't think I'll ever look at them the same way again. John nodded in agreement. Me neither. They turned back toward the house, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Tonight, they had witnessed something they never expected. A wild animal, one of nature's most powerful creatures, showing trust, patience, and even something that almost felt like gratitude. And as they closed the door behind them, a new understanding settled in their hearts. Sometimes, the most unlikely visitors come not to harm, but to remind us of the quiet connections that exist between all living things. As the family closed the door behind them, the weight of the night's events slowly began to settle into a strange sense of peace. The bear, having made its silent plea for help, was gone, but the story wasn't over. The Johnson family had experienced something extraordinary, something that would stay with them forever. Inside the house, the air felt warmer, almost comforting, as the family gathered around the living room. The soft light of the lamp flickered gently, casting long shadows on the walls. Emma and Ben sat on the couch, their faces still illuminated with the awe of the moment. Mary was in the kitchen, busy preparing hot cocoa to calm their nerves. John stood by the window, his gaze drifting toward the dark woods outside. The night felt different now, quieter, more alive. Do you think the bear will come back? Ben asked, his voice filled with an innocence that tugged at John's heart. John turned around and met his son's eyes. I don't know, Ben, but maybe the bear just needed help. We gave it what we could, and that's all we could do. Mary entered the living room with steaming mugs of cocoa, the comforting smell filling the space. She handed one to each of the kids, then looked at John, her eyes soft. I'm proud of how you handled that, John. I know it wasn't easy. John smiled faintly, grateful for her support. It's not every day a bear knocks on your door. But I guess we did what we had to. The tension in the room had dissipated. What had been a terrifying ordeal turned into an unforgettable lesson, one about compassion, patience, and the strange ways in which nature can reach out for help. As they sat together, sipping cocoa and talking quietly, John couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of connection with the world around him. The bear, in its own way, had taught them something. It had reminded them of the delicate balance of nature, of the fact that animals, too, have families to protect, and sometimes even they need a hand. Maybe we should check on the rabbits tomorrow, Mary suggested softly, just to make sure they're okay. John nodded, already planning the next steps. He knew that tomorrow would be a new day, a day to see if the mother rabbit had returned, if the babies had made it through the night. But whatever happened, he knew the family had done their part. They had been a small but significant part of something much bigger, something they would never forget. The night settled around them, peaceful and quiet. Through the window, John could still see the outline of the trees swaying in the breeze, the soft glow of moonlight casting shadows on the ground. For the first time in hours, he felt at ease, knowing that their home had been part of something greater. A reminder that even in the most unexpected situations, there is room for kindness, for action, and for understanding. And in the morning, whatever came next, they would face it as a family, united by an experience that had changed them all. The house had finally settled into silence. The night had been unlike any other, but now, with the bear gone and the rabbits safely tucked away, a sense of peace returned. The Johnson family sat together in the living room, processing everything that had happened. Emma leaned against her mother, her eyes still filled with wonder. "I never thought a bear could ask for help," she murmured. Mary smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But I guess nature has its own way of speaking to us." Ben, who had been unusually quiet, finally looked up. "Do you think the bear will be okay?" John took a deep breath, glancing toward the dark woods outside. "I think so, buddy. It knew what it was doing. And I think, in some way, it trusted us." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but they rang true. The bear had come to their home, not with aggression, but with purpose. It had needed something, and, somehow, it had found a way to get the family to understand. In return, they had responded, not with fear, but with compassion. Mary reached for John's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Not many people get to experience something like this," she said. "It's special." John nodded, staring out the window once more. The forest looked as it always had, dark, vast, and endless. But tonight, it felt different. It wasn't just trees and shadows. It was alive, full of connections they had never noticed before. "We should tell people," Emma suddenly said, "so they know animals are more than just wild things to be afraid of." John smiled at his daughter's words. "You're right. Sometimes they just need understanding." As the night stretched on, the family slowly made their way to bed, each of them carrying the weight of the evening's events in their own way. But one thing was certain. Tonight, they had learned something unforgettable. And somewhere in the woods, under the vast, starry sky, a bear walked away from a small farmhouse, leaving behind a story that would forever change the way one family saw the world. If this script is for a YouTube video, you might add a final message to the audience. Nature is full of mysteries, and sometimes, even the wildest creatures surprise us with their intelligence, emotion, and trust. This story reminds us that every life, big or small, deserves compassion. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming animal rescue stories. And remember, kindness can come in the most unexpected ways.